Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we will talk about all the kings of Portugal in chronological order. In the last episode, we took a look at how King Sancho I conducted himself as an adult in the years preceding his time on the throne. We also saw that Sancho I guaranteed offspring by marrying Dulce of Aragon, a marriage that resulted in 9 legitimate children. We ended with a very important moment in King Sancho I's life, the defense of the city of Santarém against an Almohad force that was far superior to his own. In today's episode, we'll finally see King Sancho I as King of Portugal, and what his first actions were now that he is sitting on the throne, that had belonged to his father for many years. We will learn about his strategies for organizing the territory and protecting his borders, as well as his relationship with the nobles between the Douro and Minho region. But before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that you can listen to all the episodes released so far via our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com. You can also follow us on social media so that you're always up to date when we release new episodes and many other things. So stop by and give us a like and a follow. And if you are feeling generous and would like to contribute to the insurmountable amount of coffee that we need to keep our episodes fresh, stop by our Patreon. Now, let's get down to business. Let's start where we left off in the previous episode. The most important event for Sancho and for Portugal, near the end of the founding king's death. This event was the Almohad siege of Santarém. In it, Sancho is undoubtedly the hero, who holds off the charge of a much superior army on the outskirts of the city, sometimes in very adverse situations, and ends up forcing the enemy army to retreat, with many casualties among the soldiers and even among the illustrious Muslim generals. The heaviest casualty of them all was Caliph Yusuf I himself, who died a few days later as a consequence of this battle. It is true that, according to the Arab chronicles, there were rumors that several armies were on their way to the square of Santarém, including those of King Ferdinand II of Leon, a contingent from the bishopric of Porto, a significant force led by the Archbishop of Compostela, and finally, the host of King Afonso Henriques himself, who was apparently in command despite all the physical limitations we've mentioned before, and who, at the time of the Muslim retreat, was already nearby in Porto de Mós. This event was extremely important because it helps to reinforce the idea that we shouldn't underestimate the value of King Sancho, co-regent of Portugal, king by titulature of the documents and heir to the throne in Coimbra. It seemed that, despite all the setbacks, Portugal's second monarch would keep the kingdom cohesive, dynamic, and able to hold off its enemies. We have now reached the 6th of December, 1185, and the most attentive of you will know that this was the day that King Afonso Henriques left this world. We don't know the cause of his death, since it seems that the monarch himself did not expect this outcome, at least immediately, since he didn't prepare his soul, nor did he buy the way into the afterlife through donations or other measures so typical of the men and women of the time. According to the tradition of the time, Sancho was acclaimed king in the streets of Coimbra 3 days after his father's death, since he apparently wasn't even in the capital when his father died. Whether intentional or not, the fact is that Sancho was acclaimed king on the 9th of December, and that is the day of Saint Leucadia, a Hispanic martyr from the beginnings of Christianity in the peninsula, deeply linked to the Visigothic royalty of Toledo, and also linked to the Reconquista. Rather auspicious, don't you think? Furthermore, this saint was particularly venerated in the Mozarabic tradition, which had not yet been completely cancelled out in Coimbra, or the south of the peninsula at the time. These were all favorable signs for a reign that was to be as strong and memorable as his father's had been. But there was another promising premonition. At this time, Queen Dulce was pregnant for the fourth time. She had already given birth to 3 girls. Teresa, who was born 10 years ago in 1175 or 76, Sancha, who was at this time around 5 years old, born in 1180, and Constanza, who was just 3 years old, born in 1182. At this point, Dulce was already 5 months pregnant, and there was hope that the 4th attempt would be the one and that a male child would be born. And so it was. On the 23rd of April, 1186, the first son was born, and Sancho named him after his father and founder of the kingdom, Afonso. He would later be known to history as King Afonso II. And since we've mentioned the relationship between the day of Sancho's acclamation as king and the day of Saint Leucadia, we can't brush off the date of birth of Afonso, son of Sancho I and Dulce, without mentioning Saint George, the saint who is depicted on a horse fighting a dragon. Yes, you heard it right, a dragon. This dragon used to represent Satan, but during the Reconquista it also represented the Muslims. This was not yet a great saint for the Portuguese, but he would become one when the Castilians began to use the cry of Saint James against the Portuguese in the Fernandine Wars. But that's a topic for later episodes. Read a bit on the saint, you won't regret it. Focusing again on King Sancho I, his reign was remarkable in 3 main areas: the settlement and consolidation of territories, the wars against the Almohads and Leonese, and the conflict with the Church. We'll try to deal with the last 2 issues chronologically, but with regard to the first, we can already unveil some of the actions taken. We've already seen that the Almohads had tremendous power in this period, and the defense of the Portuguese kingdom's border territories became extremely important. So, King Sancho I began to invest heavily in the various monastic military orders, giving them castles and territories to administer, protect, and help settle. And if his father had greatly favored the Order of the Temple and its master in Portugal, Gualdim Pais, Sancho would diversify these agencies a bit more. An example of these border reinforcements: in 1186, the king donated Almada, Palmela, and Alcácer do Sal to the Order of St. James of the Sword, also known as the Order of Santiago. But why these cities in particular? Well, if we take a look at the map, we can see that these towns, as a whole, block the main accesses to Lisbon via the Setúbal Peninsula. Mainly, the city of Alcácer do Sal, known as the Gateway to the Alentejo, was the latch on the southern gateway to the city of Lisbon. Almada blocked attacks from the south bank, and Palmela, given its centrality on the Setúbal Peninsula, served for some more years as the capital of the members of the Order of St. James in Portugal. And still on the subject of border reinforcement, further east, the Order of Calatrava, founded in Castile, was granted land near Évora, Coruche, Benavente, and Santarém, which added to the donations made along the banks of the Tagus River in Mação and Alcanede, and near Mafra, thus helping to block access to Lisbon from the north. The Hospitallers received land around the current parish of Belver, on condition that they would build a castle there, which they did. And we mustn't forget the Knights of Évora, a popular militia organized somewhat in the style of the military orders, and which, in the future, by merging with the Portuguese branch of the Order of Calatrava, would give rise to the Order of Avis, which would be extremely important for Portugal at the end of the Middle Ages and in the shaping of a globalized world. King Sancho I used the military orders above all as a way of defending, populating, and managing the territories on the border with Islam. This was because, theoretically, these warrior monks could not take part in wars between Christians, meaning that having religious and/or military orders on the border with the Kingdom of Leon would be of little use. But Sancho had a trick up his sleeve. He focused, above all else, on the creation of councils with existing settlements and the foundation of new plazas, which were also given charters and municipal powers. As many scholars argue, King Sancho I was the first king to use the charter as a weapon to control the landed aristocracy of the lands between Douro and Minho, or should we say between Minho and Voga. As we mentioned earlier, among the charters that King Sancho I issued, many were aimed at the existing border towns or the foundation of new ones, such as Covilhã around this time and Guarda a few years later in 1199. The objective here is clear: to control, populate, and strengthen the territories along the border with the Christian kingdoms, to prevent the latter from claiming these areas whose ownership was still poorly defined, and to serve as defensive bulwarks in the event of a war. Were we to look at a map of these charters that King Sancho I granted, an extraordinary fact would immediately come to light. The greatest concentration of these points is precisely in an area that surrounds the between Minho and Voga rivers, from the Chaves and Montalegre area to the Douro River in the Vila Real area, and then following another route through the Voga River valley to the sea. But if the border is so far away, what was the purpose of these measures? Although we've discussed this issue in the past, it's worth revisiting it now. A charter is a way of controlling territory or affirming the authority of the person who issues it, but it also has the effect of creating, in practice, a municipality. This is due to these documents granting a series of rights and duties for the people, namely in the area covered by the municipality, the permitted activities, the privileges of the people, and the taxes to be levied, which, despite the fact that, just like now, taxes are one of those things that nobody likes, the predictability expressed in the document and the fact that legally no new taxes could be created except on a national level gave the population some assurance and peace of mind. Also, these charters endowed that town with a local administration, the so-called Domus Municipalis, the equivalent of the town hall today. But this wasn't all that a charter did. These charters, issued by the king, also allowed the emancipation of those populations from powers other than that of the crown, and therefore immunity from the powers of the nobles or other lords. Although, from the end of the Middle Ages on, there were some exceptions. Once a land became a municipality, it no longer became anyone's landlord. But these charters also benefited the people of those lands beyond the interests of the king, because by building what historian José Matoso called a wall of council lands, lands that were around the heavily manorialized territories between Douro and Minho, or between Minho and Voga as we've seen, it keeps the nobles and lords trapped in a corner in the northwest of Portugal, without much chance of expanding their lands beyond that area. Outside this area, the only nobles who existed were at the head of their military contingents in campaigns organized by the crown or serving in the royal court in Coimbra. And in the latter case, although they could have houses or palaces to settle in, during that time they had no privileges comparable to those nobles in their mini empires up north. We're now done talking about what King Sancho I did to settle and consolidate his territory, but we will come back to some of these points if it's relevant. Now we move on to another important aspect of King Sancho I's reign, which is his political development, wars, conquests, and losses of territory. We're going to try to guide you as chronologically as possible as part of the effort we make to keep these stories accessible to you. But we're also going to add another thread to this narrative: the birth of the royal couple's remaining children. We can then set our foot in 1186, a year that didn't pose any major problems for the kingdom in terms of foreign policy, since we saw that King Sancho I seemed to be very concerned with strengthening the border with Leon, and, as we will see later, solving the ecclesiastical conflicts within his territory for the first time. Do not be fooled, these were not peaceful times, because in the summer of that same year, at least as far as we can see from the documentation, the Bishop of Braga himself, Godinho, was accompanying the Portuguese armies near the borders of the kingdom, as we read in these documents. Later that year, Sancho I promised the Évora militia the castles of Jurumanha, Alpedriz, and Alcanede, if God grants them to me, as the documents say. This meant that he no longer had them in his possession, and that he intended to reconquer them, perhaps in the campaign that was underway. But there is a common problem for historians who study this reign. Apart from these signs, which are circumstantial evidence at best, there is no other evidence to prove that there were military campaigns against the Muslims in that year of 1186. And if they did take place, they weren't fruitful. Otherwise, we would know from the scribes of the Church of the Holy Cross in Coimbra, or the Chancellery. Since we're on the topic of the Chancellery, we can't go on about the reign of King Sancho I and, above all else, the future conflicts with the Church, without first mentioning what was perhaps the most influential person in Portugal, besides the king, of course, the Chancellor Julião Paes. If he wasn't the first layman to occupy the position of Chancellor of the Court, he was undoubtedly the first to acquire great importance in the political events of the kingdom. Julião Paes succeeded Mestre Alberto, Chancellor of King Afonso Henriques, while the king was still alive, 3 years ago, in 1183. But unlike other positions in the court, in which there was rotation and there were some unsavory departures, Julião remained in office throughout the reign of King Sancho I, and continued until the beginning of his son's reign. To see how important his name had become, he was all the Pope talked about when he accused him of being the main person responsible for the king's bad decisions regarding the Church during the conflicts between these two institutions. Back to King Sancho I and the Kingdom of Portugal. As we saw in the previous episode, Coimbra was increasingly becoming the capital, in a relatively modern sense of the term, since King Afonso Henriques and his heir, now King Sancho I, stayed there most of the time, and even when traveling, signed and dated the documents with the location of Coimbra. But now Sancho would do things differently. It's true that the main bodies of this proto-state were based in that city on the Mondego River, but the documentation allows us to state that between 1186 and the end of the king's life, there wasn't a single year in which he and his court didn't travel at least once. Sancho governed in situ, meaning he governed in close proximity to the problems presented to him. As early as the spring of that year, as we will see, we'll find the king in Tomar, having returned to Coimbra before July, or even that month. Between August and October, it's possible that King Sancho I had been leading his armies in that debatable campaign we talked about before, which Bishop Godinho of Braga mentions. The king seems to have spent Christmas in Guimarães, right at the heart of the manorial lands between Douro and Minho. Now we see that, at the beginning of his reign, it wasn't just his neighbors, both Muslim and Christian, that Sancho I had to worry about, and we can see that he felt a clear need to show the lords and nobles in his territory who really was in charge there. We can say this because in October 1186, he had removed his steward, the Lord of Suverosa, Vasco Fernandes, who was the owner of vast tracts of land in that province, and the following year, in 1187, King Sancho I would march with his troops through those lands in the so-called Piconha Raid. In line with this trend, King Sancho I also put military pressure on the Braganções, the lords of Bragança, and the surrounding lands, who never again held office at court until the end of his life and the life of his successor. In 1187, he gave Bragança a charter. All of this and other evidence, which we want to spare you because it's not so clear and requires much more explanation, leads us to believe that King Sancho I began to sow problems with the nobles of his kingdom from an early age, which continued to be a problem until the reign of King Afonso III, and was even the justification for the deposition of King Sancho II. All of this we'll see later on. But we will give you a taste of some of the other signs of trouble. When Sancho I had his first will drawn up in 1188, he mentioned issues with regards to, and I quote, "those of my nobles who didn't want to serve me." It is clear that there were problems between the Portuguese nobles and the king, but who was Sancho I referring to? One would certainly be the Lord of Suvarosa, who was removed from office as we have seen, and who at the time was happily managing the tenancy of Zamora on behalf of King Ferdinand II of Leon. But we do have to say that at this time it was very common for nobles from one country to go and serve another king when they felt displeased or offended by their monarch. Mind you, we say at this time, but this was also true in future times. Just think of the name of Fernão Magalhães. The case of the former aide of King Sancho I that we've mentioned before may not have been the only one, which led the king to draw up a will perhaps because he feared revolts, betrayals, or perhaps even feared for his life and the future of his dynasty. Before we bring this episode to an end, and I promise you that in the next one we will see King Sancho I hitting the Saracens of the Algarve hard, let's just give a brief summary of a subject that we will talk about in more detail in the next episode. As we've said in the last episode, King Sancho I doesn't deserve the nickname the Settler or the Populator just because of his charters and his ability to reorganize the kingdom. We've said in a humorous way that the king also helped populate Portugal with his offspring, and although they were numerous, the number of children he had with Dulce doesn't compare with the children he fathered out of wedlock. We know that Sancho had 9 children with Queen Dulce, and 11 from other relationships he had, before and during his marriage. But we also know that there is some contradictory information regarding the birth dates of the legitimate children. That is to say, children born of the royal marriage. From the information we have about the births of these children, we can see that there is something not quite right. Could twins have been born? Could the same thing have happened to King Sancho I, whose son was renamed when he was very young? Could one of his sons have died prematurely? Or are we talking about a mistake on the part of the chroniclers and scribes? We will answer all these questions and delve deeper into the subject in the next episode. And that concludes this episode, where we finally see Sancho I being acclaimed King of Portugal, and his entire strategy to strengthen the borders, both with the Muslims and with his Christian neighbor Ferdinand II of Leon. We also saw that he wasn't on the best of terms with the lords of the north, and that he was keen to really show who's boss. Don't miss the next episode where we will continue the story of King Sancho I, now as King of Portugal, where we will start by talking in more detail about his descendants, both legitimate and illegitimate. We will see you in the next episode. Take care, kings and queens.